Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 27th of July. Today's video will be very pointed, focusing specifically on Krasnohorivka and then the Russian exploitation west of the Vovcha River, which is becoming increasingly more significant. And so there was actually some news that I saw just a few minutes ago surrounding Russian advances just south of Krasnohorivka. I even have one of the markers showing the extent of the advance based on geolocations. A lot of these may be aftermath videos from the past 2 days of significant Russian armored assaults that, for the most part, were repelled by Ukraine's 79th Air Assault Brigade. But that is not today's focus because there are two more important developments that we're going to look at. And tomorrow I'll really take a closer look at the situation further south around Krasnohorivka. For now, let's begin by looking at Krasnohorivka. And you can see here that I have the polygon in yellow. If you guys prefer purple, then I'll begin using purple as the cutout to show how the Russians are advancing on a day-to-day basis. But looking at the extent of the advance, the Russian forces accumulated, it says 49 hectares. And then looking at the extent of the advance, if we're measuring it out from the southern tip, it's about 1 kilometer at most. The Russian forces here have been able to push through some of the final remaining parts of the northwestern residential areas and actually hoisted a flag above one of these houses along a horizontal road that is rather important if you zoom in. The horizontal road the Russians were able to bypass in yesterday's video is called Nakhimova Street. You see it over here. And then looking a bit north, you have Bielskoho. That's the name of this street, and it's the one that the Russian forces have now been able to go past. And if you look at where it leads to, going further westwards, it's a part of the more rural in nature section of Krasnohorivka, where you do have some of the remnants of the forward defense base of the town, including elements of the 117th Territorial Defense Brigade, 80th Air Assault Brigade, and at least one battalion from the 59th Motorized Brigade. And so whatever's left of the defense in this region, they are generally congregated around these houses, which is along a rather wide front, but it is not really that much in terms of its depth. And so let's actually zoom in and see the geolocation again. Here you can see that the Russian flag was raised in northern Krasnohorivka. And there are some allegations that it may have been a drone, which of course anything's possible at this point in time, because there have been so many videos nowadays of drones hoisting flags and then they're taken for PR purposes. But generally, this advance is in line with the reporting from the past week of gradual Russian pushes from one block to another, one house to another. And it appears to have reached a certain inflection point where it was no longer possible for the Ukrainians to resist in such a small, compact point. Because by this point in time, the Russians know there are no Ukrainian soldiers hiding in basements or houses in these regions here, because they've cleared all of them up. And so if they're looking for a certain region to target Ukrainians near the front line, then it's all within this very small perimeter. And so you're just going to have a massive amount of artillery strikes directed into this one area. And of course, the Russian FPV crews that are operating around here, like the Roks FPV units, and they're just continually hammering the region. And at this point, I don't know how much cover there really is in these regions. And so the Ukrainians, whatever's left of their squads here, they did probably make the decision to advance either westwards to this decentralized area near the Lazova River, or just cross the floodplain and go to Korpskoy Street further north, where there is going to be some sort of Ukrainian protracted resistance, which we're going to look at next. But in the immediate future, the Russians are now looking to clear out the remaining portions south of the floodplain, which would be considered a part of Krasnohorivka proper. And then the next step is to look at clearing out the final houses that are located just north of Krasnohorivka. Because at that point, once you clear out those final houses, which I guess I can mark with these red rectangles, you no longer have any sort of organized base with houses that is located basically to the east of the Vovcha River. If you look at some of the locations over here, they are basically right next to the river. And so technically you could say, oh, that's on the eastern bank. And obviously you're not wrong, but I'm talking about in a depth of, measuring 6, 7, 8 meters, 10 meters, 11 westwards or eastwards. There's no longer going to be any way for the Ukrainians to continue resisting in the way they have been, utilizing an area like Krasnohorivka. And so over a period of time, which I can't really talk about, I don't really know, the Russian forces will then eventually be able to gain and consolidate positions all across this large swath of fields over here, and then actually reach the Vovcha River line. If you're looking to be technical, you could look further south and you see that there's Hostre. This is a hamlet that is actually east of the river, but it is relatively far away from Krasnohorivka. And now we're going to talk about why it's important, because the Russian forces, they have been able to secure a breakthrough over the past week to advance from Herhivka all the way into Maximilianivka, an advance amounting to about 1.8 kilometers westwards, actually reaching pretty close to the center of the village in a pretty quick period of time. There wasn't much fighting in the eastern approaches. The Russians were able to sense a gap in the Ukrainian lines, despite the advance being rather narrow along one road. They were able to do it, and at this point, the situation has sort of stabilized. But the Russians really are planning to build up a very strong attack vector utilizing this chain of villages, which begins in Marinka, which is now becoming a massive Russian hub for infantry and armored vehicles, and then extending further and further westwards. Now, the concern for the Russians would be the southern flank, and so their goal presumably would be to finally expel the Ukrainian defenders from this forward trench over here, which would then give them the potential to finally clear out all of these fields southwards, all of this highway portion, all of the hills that are located in this region that I'm going over with the cursor. And at that point, they would have a strong enough flank and a strong enough base in an area like Maximilianivka that they would have this massive salient that is only located, if you measure it out, about 3 kilometers away from Kurakove, a massive Ukrainian command logistics hub in the region. And if you're measuring it out, only about 1 kilometer away from Hostre. And if you are also looking at it, only about 3 kilometers away from the Vovcha River in this area. And so this is where I think we're going to begin to see the axis from Marinka and Krasnohorivka collide, because since the beginning of the Krasnohorivka operation, which I think started, maybe I'm way off about this, but I think it started in November or December. Since the beginning of that operation, or the crossing, may have been actually the actual infiltration beginning in earnest around March or April. But since that point in time, the units that have been conducting attacks have been different. They've been attacking along different routes because, of course, one side is going west and the other is going north. And so there has been not that much coordination. And a lot of that's because of this sort of 90-degree angle that is formed by the Ukrainian forces that are located around this pond region. And I just don't see how they hold on to this region anymore. It's located on a very low-lying valley that is completely overlooked by the Russian forces, holding on to positions on the ridge in the southern portion of Krasnohorivka. And that ridge extends even further eastwards into areas within, the suburbs of Donetsk and then Donetsk itself. And so the Russians have just a massive artillery battery, many batteries that are stationed along this western part of the city, located on a massive ridge that then goes in to the Pokrovsk district over here, and then fires towards whatever Ukrainians remain in fields that are 15 kilometers away. And so you can see that with the forces here, they're going to be very exposed from the flanks, and they're going to be squeezed out whatever groups are still left here. And then what it means is that the Russian forces will have the opportunity to utilize this rail line over here, and that would be a vector that the Russian forces really would like to neuter from the Ukrainian side, so the Ukrainians can't use it anymore, and then the Russians want to flip the switch and begin utilizing it as a means of advancing towards Hostre and towards the Vovcha River line itself. When you look at it, there are just so many populated regions here where the Ukrainians are beginning to build up defenses. They have done that for a while, since the beginning of the year. And when you look at it, they have this massive hill that is located just to the west of the river. And that's going to be one of the biggest challenges for the Russians, being able to deal with the Ukrainians having a massive height advantage, which in the short term, once the Russians reach that area, they will not be able to neuter physically. And so that's going to be a concern for the Russians. Looking a bit northward, if you look at elevation, then you have, of course, the extension of the ridge from Donetsk itself. It extends into Nevelske and then into some of the fields that are sort of floating around here westwards. And it actually is in what is considered to be Ukrainian-controlled territory, but there aren't many, discernible areas where Ukrainians can operate here in the open at this point in time. It is way too dangerous. Whenever Ukrainians are here, it's only for very short periods of time to try to move in and out of trenches or go to Krasnohorivka further south. And so I don't really think they're utilizing these heights in any capacity, but the Russians would like to, of course, take it over for their own advantage looking further into the future. But then again, with the fall of Krasnohorivka, then with the fall of any nearby rural areas, it would mean the end for any sort of Ukrainian presence in this height area over here and for any other defenses that the Ukrainians built up. And most of these defenses are not organized, they're more so sporadic, but they are still notable enough that they've been able to drag out the fighting and prevent the Russians from fully taking them over. And when it comes to stretching out the Russians, that's what the Ukrainians are going to try to do. They're going to try to buy time with whatever forces they deem necessary within these houses. That, again, they're going to be being really pounded right now. And it is a relatively small surface area. And their logistic hubs are really difficult to connect to. If you're looking at routes to supply these forces, then you look at this road over here. It's just a massive route to go through. It's like 7 kilometers to make this entire course. You could also go along the river. That's also a rather long route. You could try going through fields, which is, of course, very difficult depending on the terrain factors and then also being spotted out in the open. And so consistently supplying them over a large period of time is also going to become extremely difficult. And so what I think we're going to see is further attempts by the Ukrainians further westwards to begin to try to consolidate in lieu for the eventual Russian attempts to cross over this really significant line, which I do think is going to be a big test for the Russians because it is a line that the Ukrainians have built up for the purpose of mounting an extremely long-term sort of defensive campaign with elevation on their side, with trenches on their side. And that sort of combination is one that I like to see juxtaposed to the Russians trying to utilize their firepower and momentum from already existing offensives. Looking further north, I'm not really going to comment again on Yazoberdivka, but a lot of Ukrainian channels are mentioning it. Now we finally know the unit that actually took it over, or at least entered it. 1,453rd Territorial Motor Rifle Regiment. And there are just so many of these Russian units that were either created in 2023 or 24. And so you'd assume that they don't really have the best experience. But after being thrown into fighting around Avdiivka and then all the villages since then, they definitely do have a lot of fighting under their sleeves. And a lot of that is occurring along the same sector. So they've been for months upon months in relatively the same area. And so they've become rather knowledgeable with the terrain over here and with day-to-day fighting. And so you can compare that to Ukrainians, where a lot of the time the situation is volatile. They're moving in units in and out, and so they're not as familiar with the locations over here. And then sometimes they are more overwhelmed because they were just moved in from a totally different area, not given the proper rest because they're just needed to quickly fill in gaps. While a lot of these territorial units that I've been monitoring, for instance, from the 27th Motor Rifle Division, they were given sufficient amount of time in between major offensive activities from one river line to another to actually rest. And so the Russians have, due to the creation of these territorial units, the ability to rotate them in and out. And if, for instance, they're tired after a certain engagement in a village, then you have a whole host of other units that are far more experienced and have been existing for years upon years, and then they are able to, of course, operate in their stead. And so, for instance, you have the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, very big unit that was involved in the capture of Cheratina and in the rail line attacks since then. Now it has a bit more of a diminished presence because most of the Russian attacks, as I've said, are coming from the 27th Division, which really does have to be noted. It also includes this regiment over here. In total, it includes 3 motor rifle regiments, and they're some of the Russian vanguard, you could say. There's also a few other units here, like 35th Brigade, that have on and off sort of presences, and also 21st Brigade. A lot of armored elements further south around Umanske are operating, and their sort of organization point is around Orlivka, which has become a really important logistics hub for the Russians in between Avdiivka and the front line. Now, looking further northward, I have marked in purple the Russian advances from the past 24 hours. You could see that in their size, it is nearly 4 square kilometers. The Russian pace is not decreasing, you could say. Here in the video from yesterday, they captured around 3.5 square kilometers. And now you could see that based on the confirmation essentially from Deep State and Petrenko and again various other Ukrainian sources, including directly from the 47th Mechanized Brigade. All of Vovcha has been taken over by the Russians. At this point, all the battles that were occurring back and forth in the southern farms are over. The Russians have been able to secure it, and at the same time, they've been able to secure this final stronghold that the Ukrainians tried to hold out at for a very long time. The Ukrainians, at least one battalion of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, maybe the 3rd Battalion, maybe I'm wrong, they were trying to conduct these Bradley assaults, trying to push back Russian infantry using the Strike Drone Company to target individual Russian soldiers advancing into Ivanivka. For a period of like 2 weeks, they were able to hold the line at the same spots. At this point, with the fall of Vovcha, their defense here became superfluous. There was no way for them to hold on to it with the flanks, and so they withdrew, and the Russians are now consolidating control over that position and have fully taken over the trench. Now, looking forward, with the Russian advance, which has a maximum extent of over 1 kilometer actually, it is occurring entirely on a hill that extends out of the rail embankment and then goes further south all the way to overlook much of the river valley on which Vovcha River is located in the nearby villages also, and of course the village of Zelane, a village which is pretty close to where the Russians are currently operating. Same thing with Serhivka. A lot of these villages are now under immediate danger because if you measure it out, the Russians are only about 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers each away from these villages. The Russians will reach these areas rather quickly, and they're doing so with the support from the higher elevation. And Zelana, for instance, is just an extension of a lower lying floodplain coming out from Hordivka. And so the situation for the Ukrainian defenders who have just endured this sort of routing occurring around areas like Pokrovsk and Vovcha, they're not able to catch a break. They try to reorganize around Zelana, trying to set up a sort of straight perimeter over here along this line following the loss of Vovcha. That's what they're hoping for right now, to hold onto the hills over here with the red line marked. But given the momentum of the Russian forces on a daily basis, it is becoming unlikely. And so then the fighting will shift southwards into Zelane. And at that point, the height advantage does become really illuminated from an on-the-ground perspective. And you zoom in, and the Russian forces are very close to taking over one of the only Ukrainian strongholds that is protecting that northern flank at the moment. And so that will also be a loss. Looking further south, a lot of these strong points that the Ukrainians built up, and you could see how they were angled. It was coming from a perspective that the Ukrainians would be able to hold on to the entire river line in its full extent. And that is simply not true. Even though they've been able to hold on to the vast majority of the river line, if you go further south, the one area where it was most narrow and where the elevation was the least conducive, where also you didn't have a strong Ukrainian defense base in terms of the unit composition there, that's the one area where the Russians exploited. And now they have just this total domination of the northern flank and can individually just one by one go over and begin taking over these strong points from angles, from directions that were just totally unexpected. And so that takes a lot of pressure off of the Russian forces that are previously operating in areas like Novoselivka, Persha, and Umanska. Looking further westwards, the Russian forces advanced, 1.3 kilometers westwards. They're now operating on the eastern outskirts of Vesele. Vesele, very small hamlet, also located on a valley overlooked by the rail embankment, which really has become the most formidable geographic asset for the Russians. You zoom in, there's not a lot of room for defenders in the region, and the defenders that are here have only recently come, most of them withdrawing from regions like the pocket of the 31st Brigade or directly from Pokrovsk. And so it will be interesting to see if the Russians decide to just completely infiltrate it now following their capture of the nearby tree lines and, of course, DRG activity that is occurring right around the perimeter of the village. And also, we haven't seen anything from Ivanivka this day, but I'm really interested to see how the Russian movement unfolds here, because the Russian forces definitely are looking to close off these final gaps east of the vertical road over here to try to secure the entirety of the hills north of Pokrovsk. And at that point, you'll have the southern flank and the eastern flank secured, both of them overlooking Ivanivka. And what the Ukrainians are currently trying to do is build up this sort of temporary line And I'm going to add in future updates the new trench lines in these regions, because this isn't the full extent of the Ukrainian defenses. Over the past few months, they've built more, and that has to be highlighted to get a full understanding of why the Ukrainians are defending in certain regions and why they aren't in others. But let's measure with this red line over here to show you guys what the Ukrainians are at least hoping from a temporary point of view for the immediate future to hold the line at. Sort of a connection between Ivanivka, some of these basically tributaries of the Torets River, then Timofivka along the river itself, and then going northwards along this hill over here into Vovcha. That would be sort of the temporary line, just in order to prevent a full collapse that would allow the Russians to then steamroll towards the entirety of the Torets River Valley and towards the highway that is located to the east of Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk, which is just of utmost importance. We can actually see that reinforcements have been moved in to help plug in holes in this direction to prevent a further breakthrough in the region. And so you have the 151st Mechanized Brigade sent in by the Ukrainians. Let's actually see where their video was recorded. I have it over here for you guys. This is from July 27th. It's from the brigade itself. It's an FPV compilation on strikes on Russian soldiers, Russian troops in dugouts, houses, whatever it may be, including some that are located in Pokrovsk and also some that are located north of Lozhovatske. What it shows is that there is a strong Russian presence in Pokrovsk, and that it is being used as a conduit between the east and west banks of the river and the rail line. And then looking northwards, we know that the Russian forces are now inching further north from Lozhovatske and are using it as a sort of base to begin attacks into Timofivka. And so that's why the 151st Brigade is monitoring that area and conducting strikes on those individual advancing soldiers. And so we have that compilation. 151st Brigade, I really would even struggle to call it mechanized. It's more so of a misnomer. It was created, I believe, in October of 2023, along with 4 other brigades. And so there were 5 mechanized brigades created, spanning from, I think, 150 to 155 in terms of their numbered order. And so 151 was first, and then 155 next. I haven't really heard much from the other ones besides 153, which I think is on the northern border right now. But 151 did have some experience. It wasn't specified where, but generally along the Donbass line during some of the recent uptick in Russian activity starting in November of 2023. And so a lot of this units is actually composed of just new recruits from 2023. The bulk of the actual units that are infantry on the front line engaging in combat on a day-to-day basis, they were new conscripts that didn't have any sort of prior service. And the brigade itself, at least on paper, should be 2,000 men. And then the officers and the NCOs, they were actually taken away from other units in order to fill the ranks of this one. And the same thing happened for all the other new brigades. And so I just find that incredible that entire new units were created. And so the Ukrainian army sort of expanded to a certain extent, became even more decentralized in a time where defense was needed and it needed to be more concentrated, where you need your NCOs and officers to stay with their original sort of recruits. And then what should have happened, in my opinion, is that there shouldn't have even been a new brigade created. Those conscripts should have been just dispersed all around to certain battalions that are definitely in need of soldiers within the most consequential parts of the front line. An entirely new unit being created instead is just completely unnecessary given the circumstances that Ukraine is facing, where they're trying to mount a protracted defensive sort of battle, trying to hold on to certain strong points where they really do need that coordination, and this simply doesn't help with that. But now that the unit has already been formed, it's hard to even call it mechanized because it really doesn't have the same firepower or the same armored protection that a mechanized unit really has. For instance, 47th Brigade is a great example of a mechanized unit that really does check all the boxes in terms of the sort of equipment that it's using, the sort of activities that it's engaged in. But then the 151st, I haven't seen it with really any of the armored fighting vehicles coming from Poland or Finland or generally from the West that have come in bulk hundreds. They're not being diverted to these units. Instead, these units are getting some of the lowest quality bottom of the barrel MTLBs, BMPs. So they're getting BMP-1s, for instance, and trucks in some cases, in the worst case scenarios. And so then at that point, is there really a mechanized unit? I don't know. But definitely in terms of sheer manpower, the Ukrainians do need men to hold the line over here, but there does need to be organization, or else there could be issues like we saw in Pokrovsk. And so that's all that for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.